So now let's look at the solutions side of the food waste problem. And I'm going to try to focus on framing out the challenges of food waste using kind of a framework that comes from a book called Switch, and I'll put the link somewhere in the comments if I can. So Switch is this book about how to change behaviors at an organizational level. And basically what they say is that it's not enough to know, what you have to do. You have to create a system that supports new behaviors and new behavior change. And so I adapted that to kind of thinking about waste audits and waste reduction strategies for K-12 and for your everyday life too. So let's take a look at this system. So when it comes to challenges addressing food waste, what is it that keeps people from doing what they need to do? Why is it that we aren't better at food waste? And a lot of times we want to just put the onus on like, I need to do better. I just need to get my act together and waste less food. And I just need to eat my salads when I buy them, even though they're gross and whatever. But the real issue is that there are at least 3 components that promote behavior change. If you're going to adopt a new behavior, you have to be able to support these 3 components, right? And make sure that that you have access to them. So the first is that you have to have knowledge about the problem. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what kinds of knowledge are important and why. So it's not just knowing all the horrible statistics that I said to you. It is also kind of like knowing how to avoid food waste and knowing what to do. So procedural knowledge as well as declarative knowledge. And then you have to have motivation to take action and change. So my experience that I shared with you on the first day of being unable to inspire students to embrace sustainability by just talking to them about soil for weeks on end. I was addressing the knowledge part for sure, but I wasn't addressing the motivation part. And so we'll take a look at what motivation looks like in addressing food waste issues. And then there's environmental factors, and that's not things like clean air or clean water or access to food. And when I say environmental factors, I'm talking about the way that your school environment or your cafeteria environment or your home environment, the way that physical structure is laid out and shaped that either contributes to our behaviors or constrains the type of actions that we engage in. So I'll give you a quick example that most teachers and educators are familiar with, and that's like recycling, right? We hear from teachers all around the country who are interested in doing a better job recycling. and when we ask, what they think the problems are, they say things like students just don't know about the needs to recycle, students are just lazy about recycling, or there are other systems problems like, people just throw stuff in the trash. And then when we dig down to what the environment looks like, then we start to find what's really, really going on. So we ask things like, where are your recycling bins? And a lot of times people don't know. And a lot of times if they do know where the recycling bins are placed in these remote locations away from where students are disposing of trash. And so if you're walking along with a water bottle that's empty and you come across the trash can first, you're going to throw the water bottle in the trash can, right? If it takes effort to get to the recycling bin, you're not going to make it to the recycling bin. And another one is that oftentimes the recycling bin is just dumped in with the trash by facilities staff. Why is that happening? Well, because they have limited time and they have limited resources. And if they are going to collect trash, that's going to take some time. And then if they're going to separate the recycling out, they have to do a whole nother run to get that recycling into the recycling bin. And there's just not enough time. So those are the kinds of environmental factors that shape behaviors and constrain the kinds of actions that we can take. If you want to know what works best for recycling bins, it's just, for recycling, it's having like a totally independent system that addresses the recycling compared to the trash. And then like it's paired side by side with everywhere there's trash or more abundant recycling bins than trash bins, for example. So we have to address these 3 factors. Knowledge, we have to make sure people know about the problem and how to fix it. Motivation, they have to be inspired to take action. And then the environment has to be structured and shaped in a way that allows for them to do the things that they need to do. All right, so now let's apply this to the school cafeteria, which is where on campus, like most of the food waste that you're gonna run into is gonna happen. So knowledge, motivation, environment, once again. So I've outlined sort of the process that you could engage students with in each of these different categories, and also given you an example. So if we take a look at knowledge, if you're trying to generate knowledge about food waste in the cafeteria, there's really two kind of components to that. You need to know what's being wasted and in how much and then why. But then you also need to know, like students also need to know what they should be doing. So what should they do to reduce food waste? And they need to practice that kind of knowledge, right? So the process could be that maybe you as a teacher facilitate students in conducting research and sharing the information that they gather from their research, right? Then they know about how food is processed and wasted in the cafeteria. Much more than they did before. And certainly in a way that is far more authentic than you just kind of telling them, as I did earlier with a litany of slides about food waste. But another thing that's important is that oftentimes in cafeterias, there aren't enough tools that communicate best practices for avoiding food waste. And so you really need to employ new tools or better tools to communicate to students what they should be doing and how they can avoid food waste. Otherwise, they just kind of do what everybody else is doing, or do what what they feel like they do what they usually do without thinking about it, and that might contribute to food waste. So maybe they're just like piling a bunch of food on their plate, for example. And so examples of knowledge generating practices in cafeterias is performing a food waste audit. It's a very easy thing to do. You can do it in a variety of ways. We're going to talk a lot about this in a little bit. But when students perform food waste audits, they really, really, really get a detailed look at what's happening in the cafeteria. And then they can start thinking about how to address those problems. But you could also just establish some good practices using signs and school announcements and other strategies to talk to students about waste avoidance. If they don't know how to avoid food waste, then they won't be able to do it when they get to the cafeteria. So that's how you can address knowledge in the school cafeteria. Again, so like performing waste audits to get statistical information, and then using science and other forms of information sharing about best practices. Those are just two examples. The motivation is really a harder part to get to establish, because like students' days and students' lives are full of all kinds of competing things, competing interests and priorities, and motivating them to adopt new behaviors is challenging. But I guarantee you this is like key to getting to addressing food waste. If students aren't motivated to make a difference, they won't. So you have to work at different strategies to inspire students to adopt new behaviors that will reduce their food waste. And you also probably need to collaborate with school stakeholders to address the problem together. Every year we hear about teachers who are they're just exhausted because they're the one teacher that is doing whatever sustainability effort they're doing. Like, they can't address the recycling program anymore because they just don't have the energy, or they're the only one that is, running the school garden program, or they're the only ones that's trying to get, the school to move forward with, energy efficient lighting. And we can't do it ourselves. And so one of the ways that you increase the motivation of individuals to address problems is by creating collaborations and groups and mobilizing our shared interests to attack a problem. So when it comes to examples of how to motivate students in schools, one very popular idea is to have some kind of zero waste food challenge where students are inspired because it's a competition or it's a challenge to reduce the food waste that they generate. And that can take all kinds of different forms. It can be something where it's like collaborative across the school grades, where everybody's doing their best to reduce food waste, and you're publishing the amount of food waste that is generated after every lunch. And so they know they're working toward reducing that huge amount of food that's going to landfill. Or it can be sort of a competition between grades and classes. Or it can just be a social media campaign. Show us your clean, your empty cafeteria tray via social media if that's appropriate for your students. And that's some way to inspire them and motivate them. I have to say that those sorts of things kind of have short-term effects. They don't last very long. And sort of once the challenge is over, you know, they kind of go back to their old ways of food waste. So it's a sort of thing where you want to vary it, you want to integrate different ways of motivating students by these challenges and keep the ball rolling. The other strategy that's very effective is creating committees or clubs of students and teachers to address this. So instead of just one teacher doing the whole thing, you're creating a support system and everybody's working together to address food waste. And then the most difficult part to change is the environment, because cafeterias are very, very carefully managed. And honestly, the back of house processes that are there are already super efficient. You're not really going to be able to make much difference in the way that food is prepared or presented to students. But there are some things that you can do. So one thing is obviously to update policies and procedures to make sure that they are up to code, up to standard, because the standards for schools are really, really, really good. They have high standards for reducing food waste or preventing food waste. You can also make processes that are more efficient. So making lunch more efficient so that students are having more time to eat their food, for example, is one way that you can change the environment. And then you can also establish new practices and routines. And I'll explain kind of what I mean by that in a second. One very challenging way to update your school food waste process is to incorporate something like food waste composting. There are very few schools that have the resources and the capacity to compost on site, but there are organizations that are starting to realize the value of food waste from school cafeterias, restaurants, and other large sources of food waste, and starting to develop business models and enterprises that collect that food waste and turn it into compost. In Arizona, there are two. One is called Recycle City, and they work with businesses, schools, and homes to collect food waste on a daily or weekly basis, and they do all of their composting at a farm in town. And the other is called the Arizona Worm Farm. Absolutely just what it sounds like. They take huge amounts of food waste and they use vermicomposting, so they're feeding it to worms essentially, and creating really, really high quality compost. These are massive operations that are really sophisticated and have been growing over the past 10 or 15 years. It would be very hard to start this kind of thing up in your school. And compost, if you don't know what you're doing with compost, it can get smelly, it can get yucky, etc. So Aubrey asked me to repeat those names. I'll throw them in the chat. So it's Arizona AZ Worm Farm and Recycled City. And both of those are Phoenix-based businesses. And they're partnering with schools and other businesses. And somebody else put a couple of links in there, so that's great too. Yeah, so there is, a growing system to support food waste composting, but it's just still in development. There might be something near you, and if not, maybe you can convince one of your entrepreneurial students to start a business. The other thing is, there are simple moves that you can make that make lunch more efficient. So a lot of schools have experimented with the possibility of moving recess. When you look at particularly young kids going into the school cafeteria, they've spent 3 hours in class. Yes, they're hungry, but they've been sitting in class. And so they're really, really interested in socializing and playing. And so when they get to the school cafeteria, they impatiently go through the line. There's a lot of noise and a lot of energy and a lot of movement, chaos. They get all their food. They eat, as quickly as they can. And a lot of schools that we've worked with in Arizona, they don't let students choose their seat. And so everybody just gets in line, and wherever you sit, wherever you are in line, that's the person that you sit next to. And so there's no socialization. It's just like shove food in your face, and then all the kids they want to socialize, they want to play. And so they just eat as quickly as they can, but they don't eat very much, and then they throw everything away. And when you switch that, when you put recess first, they play, they socialize, and then they're really hungry when they get to the cafeteria. They've got all their energy out, they sit down and they eat, and they eat more. So they're eating better, they're eating the healthy food, and they're reducing food waste. Now there's other problems associated with that. So if you're really interested in this kind of project, or this policy, like look it up, do some research. It's not hard to find the research and experiences of other schools, but it can be one way to reduce the food waste. So that's a new process that could make lunch more efficient. A new practice, a new routine could be switching from an offer to a serve model. Many school cafeterias have an offer model where they just, every kid gets a plate or a tray of food, and that's what they get. They don't get to choose. They don't get to choose how much. If you allow students to serve themselves, so serve from like kind of a buffet style, they take what they want. They don't take what they don't want and won't eat, and they take only the amount of food that they will eat. And so an offer versus serve model can actually reduce food waste quite a bit. When we're kind of looking at strategies for addressing food waste in K-12, you'll notice that the strategies that I am going to share with you really fall into or really pay attention to these three factors. What knowledge do people need and how do they collect it? How do we motivate students and how do we shape the environment to make a difference? Important strategies for addressing food waste in K-12. The most important strategy is actually a framing of what we should be doing with food. And so this comes from the USDA and other organizations have adopted it as well. It's called the Food Recovery Hierarchy. And what it shows you is that we have a sort of preference for what we do with food that isn't eaten, in the school cafeteria or in restaurants or whatever. And so these are the strategies that are most important for reducing food waste. The first and most important is source reduction. In the school cafeteria, that is already taken care of. The cafeteria staff is really, really diligent about reducing food waste back of house and making sure that they're not producing too much food for students in line. So they're just attuned to everything like changes in attendance, whether certain meals are preferred more than others, the amount of food that different grade levels eat. They've got that nailed down and they're very good about it. The next level is feeding hungry people. So, you might be, interested in just composting food waste, and that's a good strategy. But if you can make that food that isn't eaten in the cafeteria, if you can get that food to hungry people, that's really, really important. Oftentimes you'll hear from administration that, they have liability related issues. Thanks, Frank just posted a food recovery program for Broward schools. Awesome. I actually think I knew about that from a previous workshop that a teacher shared that with me. But the federal government provides protection. If you're delivering uneaten food items that are packaged or things like apples or oranges that are not, cut or not already started to eat, that food can be given to food banks and there isn't a liability to your school. Your school still might not do it, but at least there's not a legal issue there. Other ways that you can reduce food waste going to landfill is to partner with a local farm and use that food to feed their animals. So we've partnered with schools in, for example, in Washington State, and they were able to find a pig farmer who would take their cafeteria food and then use it to feed his pigs. There are also industrial uses for food waste, weirdly. And then there's composting. But the very last thing that we want to do is send it to a landfill or to be incinerated. So this is something to keep in mind as you're designing sort of ways to address food waste in cafeteria. Try to prioritize those more preferred methods because really food that we produce should feed people. It should go to people before some of these other options. So now I'm going to give you just a series of recommendations. I've done several food waste audits with lots of different schools, and these are sort of like what we've learned along the way, as well as what some of the research demonstrates about engaging students in problem solving in sustainability. And so the first recommendation that I have is that you do what you can to position your students as researchers and experts. In other words, using a pedagogy like problem-based learning, using the cafeteria as a research activity really does a couple of things that are important for learning. You could probably conduct your own food waste audit and then just deliver information to students. In my early years of teaching, because of the issues with managing classes in spaces like cafeterias, that's what I felt like was a good idea to do, but it doesn't make the same impact. And when students are engaged in research processes like this, it really helps them to situate the learning that they're doing in a real world context. So if you're teaching math, if you're teaching statistical analysis, averaging, if you're teaching the scientific method, there's no better way to make those subjects relevant than to show them at work in a real world context, like preventing food waste. It also allows students to practice those important research skills. I spent a lot of time as a teacher trying to develop labs that were just more than like recipe following or instruction following labs, having students try to experiment or develop their own research programs without just being fed a list of things to do is really important. The other thing is that, as you saw from those slides early, it can feel like a really hopeless situation when you're looking at food waste and all of its environmental, social, and economic impacts. But participating in research for young people is empowering. So by doing this kind of research in the school cafeteria, they're actually empowered to make change. They actually become more confident that they can make change, and they are actually more hopeful that they can make change. Mixed methods research, if you're familiar with that, that means collecting qualitative data in addition to quantitative data. So not just measuring how much trash is produced by weight, but also taking down observations about students' experiences. That research can enhance any subject area. And then the most important thing, I think, is that by positioning students as researchers, it allows them to tell their story, their experience of food waste and why it's important to them. That really enhances their motivation to make a difference. If they can't find a story about themselves in the work that they're doing, it's just going to become something that they do for a day or two and then give up on. So try to position your students as researchers. That it also takes a lot of the work away from you as the individual doing, trying to make an improvement in the cafeteria. Also, this is an important step that I think is often overlooked, and that's to define the scope and scale of your investigation. So are you going to run a food audit that's personal versus school-wide? There are some students in some classes that doing just a personal food waste audit is probably more important than doing something school-wide, or at least more practical. And that can be they just go home and they measure the amount of food waste at home. Or, at the end of their lunch, they take a quick photo of the food that's left on their tray that they throw out. Those personal food waste audits can be important too. Is your investigation going to be short-term or long-term? Is it going to be something that you do over the course of a day or a week? Or is it going to be something that you do over the course of a semester or maybe even the year? And then what variables are you interested in? Are you interested in just the total amount of food waste? Do you want to see if students are wasting, milk versus meat versus produce? Do you want to find out if, the quality of the items on the menu influences the food that ends up in the garbage? Those are all variables to consider, but define what those variables are with your students very early. And honestly, it's very easy and very effective to ask students what they're interested in as you're sort of designing out your food waste investigation. Also important to think about how your curriculum will be supported. There's lots and lots of ways to integrate your curriculum into food waste. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then this is the most important thing. Who's going to do this work and when is it going to happen? You cannot expect your cafeteria staff to perform a food waste audit because they have their hands full. They've got a very busy day. They're short-staffed in many cases. They work long hours. They've got a lot to do. But they are almost always happy to work with you to find a way to do a food waste audit with your students. I have yet to run into a cafeteria staff that is unwilling to support this kind of investigation. You have to be mindful of the constraints that they're under. And you have to be very careful not to disrupt the things that have to happen in the cafeteria, the flow of students going through the cafeteria, for example. But they're always willing to help you plan out how to do an investigation. I guarantee you though, if you just show up with a group of students one day and we're like, hey, we're gonna investigate food waste without talking to them, that's probably a recipe for disaster because it throws, throws their entire day into chaos. All right. Consider the kinds of data that you're gonna collect and evaluate. So, maybe you just wanna focus on quantitative data. So you're gonna weigh or measure the volume of trash, or you could even compare cost of disposal. That makes a good case for the administration to address food waste. Food is very, very heavy. So when it ends up in the trash and gets disposed by your municipal or private waste disposal companies, that can really contribute to the costs of the school. So some schools that have, eliminated their food waste or significantly reduced their food waste, they see huge savings in terms of the disposal costs because, it's not taking up space in their dumpsters. It weighs less. And also, if you have a lot of food waste in your dumpster, it smells bad really quickly. And so you might be like, oh, we got to get this you might be able to go from, every other day pickup to once a week pickup if you reduce enough food waste. All right. And then the other thing you can measure is the time that's allowed for eating. How long do students need to really eat the food that they're given? That's something that can be measured. I'm a mixed methods researcher, so I also like to include qualitative data. And so, what that might look like for students is, recording their food preferences. Have you ever gone to the restroom in a large airport and as you're coming out the door, there's like a little meter thing that you can use to indicate the cleanliness of the bathroom. And it's just like a row of faces, little smiley faces, less than happy faces, and then like frowny faces. And so as you're going out, you just hit one of the buttons. You can kind of do that same kind of data collection with students as they're exiting the cafeteria. Just have somebody polling them, what did you think of the meal? And they can indicate, they were happy with it, they didn't, it was okay, or they didn't like it. And that qualitative data is really important for thinking about what is being served in the cafeteria and whether or not menu choice influences food waste. And the hint is, yes, it does. There are some things that nobody likes, and so they all throw it away. You can also have students journal and collect observations about how the cafeteria is experienced by the students and what they like or dislike about it. Telling stories about their day in the cafeteria can be really insightful. It may be something that allows them to identify sources of food waste that are actually important more than just looking at the weight of food that is being thrown away. And again, I'm a mixed methods researcher, and the reason I like mixed methods is because you really need qualitative and quantitative data to understand what's happening in complex systems like the school cafeteria. Just knowing how much food is wasted is not going to tell you why it's wasted. And so collecting qualitative data is really important. So again, mixed methods researcher, that means I'm using qualitative and quantitative data. Mixed methods approaches allow you to create a rich description of cafeteria life. And what I mean by that is you can really learn how students experience cafeterias by using mixed methods. And so that could include things like surveys, like I mentioned, a very easy survey to see what food students like or how they like the meal. Journaling can be an important way for students to collect observations of what their peers are doing in the school cafeteria or how they feel about the cafeteria day by day. We conducted a research project with students at a school district in Arizona, and I honestly thought that we would learn about how they didn't like the food in the cafeteria, but we had them do several journaling sessions in the cafeteria and use that information to discuss problems that they thought were important to address. And they didn't address any of the food related stuff. They addressed entirely different social behaviors. They expressed frustration at students acting out and starting food fights and doing other things that made their days difficult. They discussed interactions between students and cafeteria staff, and discussed how oftentimes they felt like teachers were too controlling or too bossy and didn't let them socialize and give them enough time to enjoy their food. And those were completely unexpected, and we wouldn't have learned that without that qualitative approach using journals. One of my favorite approaches is called Photo Voice, and it's a tool for collecting data visually. It's a participatory action research tool, which means that you have community members empowered in collecting data and learning about their experiences. I've put a link in the slide, but it's also in the notes. There's an article about how this was used by a school to identify nutrition and food-related issues in the cafeteria. But what you see on this slide are pictures that students took with their phone that they felt captured how they felt about the cafeteria. So what was their life like in the cafeteria? They're documenting that using their phones or cameras. Another thing that's important is that you always find some way to communicate results. That means for oftentimes for data, communicating those results visually, graphically, but it also can mean communicating those results verbally. So having students, do daily announcements where they report how much food was wasted and whether that was higher or lower than previous days, or what strategies people employed, or even doing a shout out to students who did a good job reducing food waste. Communicating that information is crucial. Otherwise, the science research that you're doing just becomes siloed and doesn't become something that informs the community. And conduct regular updates to monitor progress. So if you're doing like a food waste challenge, check back in on the data regularly and share those results so everybody knows the progress that you're making. The other thing is, I think that's really important, is giving students the opportunity to share their research findings with other community members. The research project that I remembered, that I discussed a few minutes ago, we actually had hoped to allow students to have a research presentation forum where they would present the results to district leaders and community members about what they discovered about the cafeteria. And unfortunately, that was derailed by the pandemic and schools being shut down. But the research indicates that when students are empowered to share the information that they've learned from their research, it is something that cultivates an identity as a science researcher, and that's something that is really important. That students see themselves as the kind of person that is capable of contributing to scientific knowledge. They see themselves and identify themselves as experts in the community. So having students present their results to school board or to principals or even just to other students is important. On a practical level, creating a process that allows students to quickly measure food and waste accurately is essential. So the last thing you want to do is make it more difficult for students to get into and out of the cafeteria. And so what you see here is the setup by these students who are measuring food waste. And what they did is they had stations that were clearly marked where students, even very young students, could come through and deposit their food and sort their food. So they had a bucket for produce, a bucket for meat products, a bucket for liquid, and a bucket for the trash. And that makes it really, really easy to collect the data that you need. It also makes it efficient for students as they're going out the door to just drop off their food waste there. With some really, really young students, like kindergarten, first, second grade, we've employed older students to do the sorting of the food waste. So the young students drop off their tray at a station, and then older students will sort that, and it makes it go a lot faster too. One thing that's important is to collect baseline data. So try to understand the problem as it exists, and then try your waste reduction strategy and collect data again using another food waste audit to see if it worked. And this can become an iterative cycle. You can try out different strategies. You can try out different tools, try out different modes of communication over time if you really want to build this out into a long-term project. But that baseline data is important. So knowing the current state of cafeteria waste is essential. Otherwise, you don't know if you're doing a good job reducing it. All right, so let's take a look at some of the strategies that are important for addressing food waste. And they're going to end up being strategies that you might already know or that you might not think are directly related to food waste. But again, thinking about that food recovery hierarchy, our first priority really needs to be making sure that our students eat the food that's available to them. And I don't mean, eating more than they should eat or that's healthy for them to eat, but we need to develop strategies that make sure that that food gets eaten and not just thrown away. So the first and probably the most effective is converting from an offer to a serve model. I described that earlier. If kids are just getting a tray of food, oftentimes they will have more food on that tray than they eat, or they'll have items on that food that they don't want, and so they won't eat it. It'll just get thrown away. Allowing them to serve themselves buffet style is logistically a little bit more complicated for cafeteria staff, but it really does reduce the food waste, and it makes the students more likely to eat the food that they need to, that they should. The second strategy that's important, and I think it's important beyond the food waste issue, is providing culturally relevant foods. So, you have to in order to do this, you really need to have an understanding of the community of students that are served by your school cafeteria. The milk issue we discussed the first day, like milk may not be a culturally relevant food for your community. It may not be the right choice of beverage. When the Obama administration updated the food nutrition standards for schools, the biggest problem that resulted from that was that students were not familiar with the new food requirements. So they were encountering things like brown rice, whole grain breads, et cetera, that were healthier for them, but they weren't familiar with. And so they were likely to just avoid eating them and throw that away as a result. So we really have to be careful about what's being served. And sometimes that means like polling students about what their favorite foods are and thinking about the demographics of your school, to make sure that they are getting the foods they need. So culturally relevant foods, need to be addressed. We need to think about what's important, what our students like to eat, what they're familiar with, and make sure that we're offering them healthy choices that are also in line with what they eat in their homes. Otherwise, they're just going to toss it out. Lunch after recess we talked about. So bringing in students after they've been playing is a huge step towards reducing food waste. When students have recess first, they come in hungrier, they come in more likely to finish their milk if that's what they're served. And then they eat better. They eat more healthy foods, more of the foods that they like less. So if they're less likely to eat, fruits and vegetables, they'll be hungrier. They're more likely to eat it after they've come in from recess. Cooking clubs can be a really important way to reduce food waste. And this sounds counterintuitive, but by engaging students in meal planning, in planning menus that are available even in the cafeteria, or experimenting with cooking food themselves, they sort of develop this interest in the food that they have. And so they're more likely to eat food in the cafeteria if they've been able to engage in preparing it or sampling it or learning about where those ingredients come from. There was a school in the Osborne district here in Phoenix that would invite local chefs to teach kids how to prepare food. And then that food would be prepared in the school cafeteria. So students came in and learned about the food. They sampled the food, they got used to the food. And then when it appeared in the cafeteria, they weren't surprised and turned off by what was offered to them. And because it's local chefs, it's things like curry. Like how many kids have been exposed to curries and will eat curries? Well, the kids in the Osborne School District did because they had learned about it and they had sampled it and they had become familiar.